In this video, we're going to focus on functional groups. So this is the first functional group we need to be familiar with, and this is an alkane. An alkane is an hydrocarbon that only contain single carbon-hydrogen bonds. It doesn't have any double bonds or triple bonds, just all single bonds. This particular alkane is known as pentane because it has 5 carbons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Remember, methane has 1 carbon, so this is methane. Ethane has 2 carbons. Propane has 3. Butane has 4. Pentane has 5. Hexane has 6. Heptane has 7 carbons. Octane has 8. Nonane has 9. And decane has 10. Now, what functional group is represented by this molecule? So this particular molecule is known as an alkene. That's the functional group. So anytime you see a carbon-carbon double bond, it has an alkene functional group. Now, this particular alkene has 4 carbons, and the double bond is between carbons 2 and 3. So you pick the smaller of the 2 numbers, and so you call it 2-butene. Now, what about this example? What if we have a carbon-carbon triple bond? In this case, this is known as an alkyne. So that's the functional group, and the particular name for this molecule is 2-butyne. It has the suffix -ine. Now, if you want to draw the line structure for that molecule, it looks like this. And so there's 4 carbons. This is carbon 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, what functional group is represented by these molecules? These are known as cycloalkanes. It's an alkane because it only has single bonds, and it's cyclic. It forms a ring-like or circular structure. Now, the first one is known as cyclopentane because, as you can see, there's 5 carbons. And the second one has 6 carbons, and so it's called cyclohexane. Now, what about this one? Let's say if we have a cyclic structure with alternating double bonds. What functional group do we have here? This is known as an aromatic ring. Now, this particular aromatic ring has a special name called benzene. And so you'll see this a lot in a typical organic chemistry course. Now, what about this one? What if you see a halogen attach to a hydrocarbon? What's the name for it? So the functional group for this molecule is known as an alkyl halide. Now, you can also call it a haloalkane. That's another way to describe it. And so it has the functional group Rx, where R is the hydrocarbon chain and X is the halogen. It could be chlorine, X could be bromine, as we saw in this example. It could be fluorine or iodine. So that's an alkyl halide. So next up, we have an ether. An ether is basically an oxygen attached to 2 R groups. The R groups could be methyl groups, ethyl groups, and so forth. So we have 2 methyl groups attached to this ether. So it's called dimethyl ether. Ethers are polar due to the oxygen. And as long as you don't have too many hydrocarbons attached to it, if the hydrocarbon chain is not so big, it's going to be a relatively polar molecule. Now what about this one? What type of functional group do we have here? So if you see an OH group attached to an R group, this is known as an alcohol. So for this example, we have 4 carbons, and the OH group is on carbon 1, so this is called 1-butanol. For the second example, the OH group is on carbon 2, so that's going to be called 2-butanol. So if you see an OH group attached to a hydrocarbon chain, it's an alcohol. So what about this molecule? What type of functional group does it represent? And let's compare it to this one. So the first one has the generic formula RCO and then some other R group. If you see that, this is a ketone. The oxygen looks like this. Now this particular ketone has 5 carbon atoms, and this is known as a carbonyl group. Let me see that carefully. So that ketone is called 2-pentanone. On the bottom, we have an aldehyde. And if you see this RCHO, that's the functional group for an aldehyde. And this is for a ketone. So this particular aldehyde has a total of 6 carbon atoms, and the aldehyde functional group will always be at the end, so you don't need to attach a number to it. So this is simply hexanol. So instead of a OL, you can see it has the suffix AL. So that's an aldehyde. So make sure you could distinguish an aldehyde from a ketone. An aldehyde has the carbonyl functional group at the end of the chain. A ketone has the carbonyl group somewhere in the middle of the chain, and that distinguishes the two. Now for those of you who might be studying for the organic chemistry final exam, I have a video that can help you, and it's on my Patreon page. If you go to patreon.com/mathsciencetutor, you can access that page. And if you scroll down, there's a lot of other videos I have here too, but let's say if you're taking the first semester of organic chemistry, I have a 6-hour video that can help you with that if you decide to become a patron. Now, on YouTube, I have a free 2-hour trailer version of this video, but if you want the entire 6-hour video, you can access it here or on Vimeo as well. And for those of you who are taking the second semester of organic chemistry, I have an 8-hour video that you can access as well. And there's some other stuff here that you could find too. If you're taking Gen Chem or physics, I have stuff on that as well. So that's it, just in case you're interested. So what about this one? RCOOH. What functional group do you think this represents? So this is known as a carboxylic acid. So that's another functional group you need to be familiar with. And in this example, we have a total of 6 carbons, and so this is going to be called hexanoic acid. So the suffix for carboxylic acid is oic. Now what about this one? What functional group is represented by this molecule? So if you see RCOO R. What functional group do we have here? So this is represented by something called an ester. Now to name it, this portion here, this is the ethanoate part. That includes the carbon with the 2 oxygens. And so it's ethanoate because there's 2 carbons here. And the right side has a methyl group. So when you name it, you need to put it, it needs to name this one first. So it's methyl ethanoate. And so that's how you can name an ester. So the O8 part comes last. Now the next functional group we need to go over is an amine. And so the amine has an NH2 group at the end. It has hydrogen bonding, like an alcohol or a carboxylic acid. And let me give you some examples. So this is known as methyl amine. That's the common name for it. And here, what do you think this is called? What's the common name for CH3, CH2, NH2? So we have an ethyl group attached to an amine functional group, so you can call this ethyl amine. And so the common names are very straightforward. Now, what if there's a carbonyl group attached to an NH2 group? What is the functional group called? So you can write this as RCONH2. If you see that, it's the same as what you see above. So this is known as an amide or an amide. Now, this particular group, well, let's use an example to name it. How can we name this molecule? So we have a total of 4 carbon atoms. And so to name it, this is going to be butanamide. So instead of saying butane, take off the E and add amide at the end. The next one is a nitrile. So if you see a triple bond between a carbon and a nitrogen atom, you have a nitrile functional group. Here's a good example of one. CH3C triple bond N. So we have a total of 2 carbon atoms. And so this is going to be called ethane nitrile. So here's the next functional group. What functional group do we have here? If you see this, this is known as an acid anhydride. The common name for this molecule is known as acetic anhydride. When you see the word acetic, it's similar to ethyl. It has 2 carbons. Next up is an acid chloride. This is also known as acetyl chloride. Now you can have a different halogen attached to it. For instance, we could have a bromine atom attached to it, and so this would be called an acid bromide instead, or acetyl bromide. Now what about this example? Let's say if we have an SH group. And how is it similar to an OH group? Now we know if we have an OH group, it's an alcohol. But what if we have an SH group? And this is called a thiol. Now what do you think these are? Anytime you hear or if you see a sulfur attached to, let's say, a hydrocarbon, the word thio will be present. So here's some other examples. On the right, this is known as an ether. So what do you think the functional group on the left is going to be called? This is known as a thioether. Now on the right, at the bottom, this is called an ester. On the left, this is known as a thioester. So see the similarities: alcohol, thiol; ether, thioether. And here we have ester, and then thioester. So if you see an oxygen being replaced with a sulfur atom, add the prefix thio to it. The name is going to have some sort of thio on it. So what about this functional group? So what if we have an alcohol and an alkene next to each other? So this is going to be called an enol. Think of the word "en" for alkene and "ol" for alcohol. So if you see those two together, this is called an enol. So here's another one. Let's say if there's a nitrogen with two R groups and it's next to a double bond. So a carbon with a nitrogen, that's an amine, and a double bond is an alkene. So if we combine these two, we get something called an enamine or enamine. And so that's the functional group that corresponds to this molecule. Now, if you see a carbon double bonded to a nitrogen atom, this is known as an imine. Now, there's a few more examples I want to go over. What do you think this is called? Have you ever seen this molecule before? In other words, H2O2. H2O2 is hydrogen peroxide. What we have here is an organic peroxide. So if you see two oxygens attached to each other, it's a peroxide if they're attached to each other through a single bond. Now, what do you think this is called? And let me compare it to this molecule. So this molecule here, you know, is a carboxylic acid. And here we have a peroxide. So what do you think this entire molecule is called? This is known as a peroxy acid. Very similar to a carboxylic acid with a peroxide functional group. So when you combine it, you get a peroxy acid. And we're going to go over one more group. You might see this, but you may not. Or you may see an orgo too. This is known as a nitro group. You might not see this in orgo 1, but it's definitely in organic chem 2. So I'm going to stop here. There's some other functional groups to note, but these are some very common ones. Actually, there are some other ones you need to know. I wouldn't really consider them functional groups, but you need to know the names of it. So this is called a carbocation. And if you have, let's say, an odd number of electrons, this is known as a radical. And this is a carbanion. And this species is neutral, but if you see it, it's called a carbene. So I'm going to stop here. So that's it for this video. Thanks for watching.